What do you think? Well, are we good?
We have a quorum.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to call to order the Friday, May 21st meeting of the CVTA Transit Service Governance Subcommittee. We have an agenda on the screen in front of you. Everybody should have received this in advance. My name is Chet Parsons. I'm Director of Transportation at Plain RVA, and we are convening this work group to help guide development of the Transit Service Governance Report that is due to the Governor and General Assembly by the end of June. So we're approaching that end date rapidly and have made some great progress. So thank you all for your continued commitment and support. We have a statement regarding virtual meetings that was included with the packet. That has not changed. We don't need to read it out loud, but would certainly welcome any questions or concerns related to the operation of the virtual meeting and direction moving forward. I don't think we've received any comments in regards to that, so we'll go ahead and move into the roll call. Nicole?
Thank you, Chad. I'll start with Charles City County, Ms. Russell. Chesterfield County, Ms. Smith.
Here.
Hanover County, Mr. Vidunas. Henrico County, Mr. Yor. See, I think I saw him a moment ago. I know Ms. Meidler is with us today also.
Yes, Todd is joining us, and I'm kind of back up in case he's if he loses connection. So Henrico is here.
Thanks,
Todd
Sharon.
is logged in, and Sharon's here too. Thanks.
Thank you. Powhatan County, Mr. Chardine.
Here.
City of Richmond, Ms. Clark.
Here.
DRPT, Ms. Dubinsky.
Here.
Virginia Transit Association, Ms. Guthrie. GRTC, Ms. Torres.
Here.
And Plain RVA, Mr. Parsons.
Here.
Thank you. That concludes the roll call for attendance.
Great, thank you very much. We have a meeting agenda that's in front of everyone. Are there any consideration of amendments? Anybody have any requests or changes to the agenda as presented? Okay, hearing none, we'll move forward. Item 2 is approval of the CVTA Transit Service Governance Subcommittee meeting summary from May 7th. That was included in your packet starting on page 2. And we can move that into acceptance by consensus. Let's just do a voice vote. Everybody in favor of accepting the minutes or the meeting summary as presented, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it. The meeting summary is accepted as presented. The next item, item 3, is a public comment period. And this is set aside for any comments either live or virtual submitted previously. We do not have any record of comments directed to this work group at this time. And I don't believe there's anyone external on the line with us today. So we can move forward with item 4, which is the bulk of the agenda. And this is an update from the AECOM ENO Center team. And I will turn it over to Stephanie to take that next step.
Hello, good morning. I hope everyone is doing well and you can hear me clearly.
You might want to bump up your volume a little bit.
Is this better? Can you hear me better? Test mic.
It's still a little low. I have.
Hello, test, test.
It's steady. I think you're okay.
Okay. I can
Just
change
invite you to speak up nice and loud, Stephanie.
yeah, I can switch out my headset and use a different more. Is this much better?
Can't hear you now.
We don't hear you at all, Stephanie.
Hello.
We were hearing you there.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I'll just go ahead and share my screen.
Okay, Stephanie, I don't think that's better. I think that's actually a little worse.
Sorry, I'm having issues with the computer freezing. I think the first one would be better, the way, whatever you're doing it initially at first, Stephanie, and then we'll just try to crank up our volume and. Okay.
Maybe she could call in on her cell phone for the audio and do the visuals on the laptop.
Yeah, don't.
Zoom, I'm having issues with the Zoom share screen. It's you can clearly, you should be able to see my screen now.
Yes, can see your screen.
And can hear me. Okay, apologies for those technical difficulties. I may just have too many things open on my computer. But again, thank you again. Today we'll be reviewing, going over some updates for the governance study. Our goal today will be to first look at the key governance issues that we identified from the last meeting and look at some potential opportunities for moving forward using the review of peers that we looked at prior in phase 1 of this study. And then we'll talk about the next steps. So at this point, we are at phase 3, looking at the governance strategies. So as I mentioned earlier, today we'll be looking at the GRTC relative to the peer agencies and some potential options to address those key governance issues. So like we presented before last time, there are 3 main issues that we've identified that need to be addressed for this study, and I think for it to be successful. First is about the decision-making and accountability in terms of representation of elected officials on the GRTC board. There's also questions about equity of looking at the different shareholders now or stakeholders and any kind of prior investments into the system and how those can be taken into consideration. Next is the issue of board representation with the primary, I think the primary key issue there is Henrico's membership on the board, and then looking at rural representation or the other CVTA members being represented somehow on the GRTC board. And then finally looking at what that means in terms of implications for the current structure for GRTC. The grade box is another identified issue, but then it's being handled in a separate study, but still needs to be addressed and that is the evaluation of potential service for the current CVTA members that do not have GRTC service. So that would be addressed in a separate study. So in first looking at decision making and accountability, I think one of the main questions that we've been trying to answer is concerning involvement of elected officials on the board, or involvement of elected officials with in terms of making decisions about the expenditure from the CVTA dollars. So currently we can say that elected officials do have a say in the expenditure of transit funding as it relates to the CVTA. Why? Because they have representation on the CVTA board. If we look a little further, the CVTA does have a finance committee, and that finance committee is made up of the four jurisdictions that contribute the most. So we have Chesterfield, Hanover, the city, and Henrico. Then we also have that representative from the Commonwealth Transportation Board. Now, this finance committee, according to the CVTA bylaws, what their duties or responsibilities include reviewing the expenditure of funds that is received from the authority. So in terms of looking at how GRTC expends those funds, you can say that the finance committee or the elected officials on the CVTA board, they do have a say, and they have there's that accountability built in from the CVTA perspective, because they have to go through this review process. That being said, I'll continue to iterate throughout today's discussion that whatever the board and the current shareholders, they have it within the authority to do whatever they agree to do. So what we can do is try to present what considerations we should look at in making a final decision or a final recommendation. So that being said, talking about elected officials on the GRTC board, there are certain governing documents for GRTC that may have to be amended. So currently we have the umbrella agreement and the bylaws, and then the articles of reinstatement that was amended in '89, following the original that was in '73. So in the umbrella agreement, it states that the directors have to be citizens of the political subdivision. The bylaws also says nominated by the governing bodies. But then again, these can be amended by the board or by the shareholders, but ratified by the city in Chesterfield. Now, in determining whether or not we think having elected officials on the board, we need to take into account different considerations, and there are different options moving forward. First, we can talk about having the elected officials on the board. Having a GRTC board made up of elected officials would not be uncommon. A path to make sure that we have the appropriate expertise or people that have the right transportation knowledge, or can be to set up a committee structure. And the committee structure will be instituted by the board, but then the membership could include staff that are knowledgeable in, it could be areas of finance, like we see, for example, for Little Rock in Rock Region Metro, their board is made up of citizen appointees only. However, they do have staff positions, 2 staff members from the city of Little Rock that are permanent members of the board. So they have the city manager and then the finance director on their board. When we look at HRT, they have the entire board is made up of elected officials, but then they have these committees that can be staffed by the members of the committees. Do not necessarily have to be the members of the board, but can be staff members or other citizens. So that could be a potential option in looking at being able to include the people that have the right expertise from the citizenry. Another option, a second option, is to maintain the citizen appointee structure on the board. That is the status quo, what it is now, having only citizens on the board. But what can be improved or opportunities for improvement would be having a close and well-defined communication between the board of directors and the appointing bodies. Now, there's existing communication, all right, but what can be done is these can be enhanced. So we can have maybe instituted in the bylaws to determine a certain cycle of interaction between the directors and the appointing bodies, monthly or quarterly, based on whatever would suit, looking at different schedules, agendas, and what is most appropriate. So not to overburden the directors or the staff or even the appointing bodies, but having that close communication to make sure that recommendations to the board are reviewed by the appointing bodies. They have a chance to give feedback and sort of have their voice also heard in the decision-making or planning process at the board level. Again, even with this approach, this second option, which is the status quo, elected officials do have that authority when it comes to CVTA funding because they are represented on the CVTA board. A third option would be a combination. So having the bylaws amended so that the appointing bodies have their nominees either not only be citizens, but have the option of also being able to nominate someone from their governing body. Usually in agencies where we see a mix of elected officials and citizen appointees, the citizens are usually appointed by another entity. So for example, in Nashville for the RTA, they have their board made up of the governing bodies, the members from the governing body. So the mayors of the cities, the county mayors as well. But then they also have the governor who appoints citizen members to their boards. In this way, if it's to be modified to suit this, the context here in the Richmond area, instead of bringing an outside member, it could just be modified so that that appointment process that is done annually could give the option of citizen or someone from their appointed body. It could also be a staff member. But in looking at these three options when it comes to elected officials, there are different pros and cons that we may come across, and we need to take all these into consideration in making any sort of recommendation, especially to the current stakeholders in determining what changes they want to make. So first, with elected officials on the board, one, we can say that they have that credibility of being elected by the people, right? They've already passed that bar. So in some sense, it would say they represent the people. Elected officials, they also have power within their jurisdictions to effect changes. So for example, if you have a city mayor or some other elected official on the board, their voice would hold more weight, if I should put it in a sense, because they have that power within their jurisdiction, taking into consideration the other decisions that need to be made in other city departments. So they're able to make decisions that could have a stronger impact. Finally, we can also say that the elected officials, their opinions may potentially be more in line with the direction of the entire jurisdiction, because as a city or as a county, they may have a vision or a strategic direction in which they're heading. And so those transit decisions can be made in line of the broader perspective. However, there are many I don't want to say opponents, but there are some disadvantages to this too, or other factors that need to be considered when it comes to elected officials on boards. So first, because of the nature of the position, there's the potential to have competing interests. You have to not only think about transit, but then all the other departments within the city, or all the other responsibilities that need to be dealt with at the city level or at the county level. So there's that potential for competing interests, and the official may not have that dedicated voice or that dedicated mindset to only accomplish what is best for transit riders within the region or within the jurisdiction. Again, elected officials are very busy, so they may be less motivated to be engaged with the board, attend board meetings. For example, in the situation again of RTA, because they have a lot of the RTA in Nashville that we looked at, they have a lot of elected officials, both at the city level and at the county level. They have a 39-member board, but the attendance is very low. And because of that, it was recommended and they've implemented to have an executive committee. And the executive committee is made up of 12 members. But in order to have access or to be on the executive committee, one still needs to attend at least 50% of the meetings from the prior year, which is still a very low bar, showing that the participation is not as much as if you had only citizen members that were solely dedicated to transit only. So that is something that needs to be taken into consideration about the ability to actually be engaged with the day-to-day decisions of the board. And then finally, we can also talk about the different motivations that the political process will bring about, right? As an elected official, yes, you're thinking about the benefit of the entire jurisdiction, but then you're also thinking about your next election. You're also thinking about how different departments within the city or within the county will be affected by the transit decisions that you're making. For citizen appointees, we would say that ideally, the ideal situation in many areas is to have only citizen members that have some knowledge of transit, preferably some expertise in transit or in different areas. A common one is to have someone in maybe the finance or in transit planning operations. So that would be the ideal situation. The reason is with citizen members, again, they have that benefit of being solely focused on only transit and the benefit to the transit riders. They can also have that fiduciary responsibility to the agency so that they're only acting in the best interest of the agency. And finally, when there's very good communication, I believe, close communication between the citizens of an appointed body and the governing body from the city or from the county level or the jurisdictions, they can make sure that their plans, their strategic direction is aligned with that of the jurisdiction. The drawback there is that they may not have as much clout as an elected official in making sure implementation takes place when it comes to certain decisions. But these here are a summary of some of the main points that would arise, or you can say the two sides of the argument that proponents for having elected officials on boards versus those that prefer citizen appointees. I would say that when in situations where there's a tax that is levied, as in the case of the RTA, it's common to have elected officials on the board. But like we saw from the other situations that also do have like a millage levied or a tax levy, but still are made up of only citizen appointees. So for example, For Via Metro, we saw that they have a tax within the jurisdiction of the service area that is levied and is a dedicated transit tax. However, the entire board is made up of only citizens, and it actually states in their governing documents to not have any elected officials on their board. So it still can be done, whereas the citizenry can be contributing to the system, but may not have elected officials on the board. I think at the end of the day, to make that decision is to determine as the stakeholders, do you feel that you have that seat on the CVTA board is sufficient in order to review documents, in order to review expenditure, in order to review that disbursement of the funding that goes towards transit. If not, and if a preference is there's a strong desire to have that direct engagement with the day-to-day board activities, whether it's planning with operations or service, then that can also be taken into consideration and we can move forward. But again, any changes to be made is totally within the power of the existing board and the shareholders. Are there any questions at this point? Okay. So looking at the peer study summary, what you're looking at here is a table that shows GRTC on one side and the peer agencies to the right. What I want you to notice is with the appointing bodies of these peer agencies, they are very similar as you look across, right? So in terms of taxing authority, really only Via Metro in San Antonio has that dedicated tax. Their board is appointed by the governing bodies of the jurisdictions, which is similar to GRTC's current structure. For HRT, it was not only at the city county government, but then they also have the governor appointees, they have the CTV members, and then members from the Senate and the House. From Via Metro, it was purely the city council, the mayors of their counties, and they also have the county commissioner position, which is just like the head of the commission of the county. For MTA Nashville, because it is a component of the local government, it's appointed by the mayor. They have a 5-member board, which is appointed by the mayor, but then still approved by the city council. In RTA, because it was set up as a regional entity, they have representation from each of the counties and cities. And the way their system is you can have cities within counties. So in counties that have many cities opt in, they can have as many as possible. I mean, as many representatives on the board as opt in, and there's no limitation. The governor also has appoints citizen members. So they have a mixed board of elected officials and citizen members. For Rock Region, in their governance documents, they state that no elected officials can be appointed to the board. However, what they do have as standing positions are the 2 staff members from the city of Little Rock. So they have the finance person and the city manager. The rest are nominated from the jurisdictions by the governing bodies. So looking at even the board size and terms, we see that it varies. GRTC's current structure has 6 board members. The agencies that have the highest board members, 39, I'd say RTA is pretty high, and the attendance and participation is pretty low as well. But HRT also has a 15 board member. And with the other 2, Via and Little Rock, there's 11 and 12 members respectively. In terms of representation on the board, like I mentioned before, HRT and the RTA in Nashville were the only ones we saw, the only two that have elected officials on their boards. Via Metro has a citizen-only appointed board. However, it's still having elected officials on transit boards is still common. So even though it's not reflected here, it's not unheard of. It's still common. It's just usually preferred to have citizen-only boards for some of the reasons that I stated previously. In terms of qualifications, for GRTC, the only qualification was in their governance document is the residency requirement, which is waived currently. With the other agencies we looked at, besides having some sort of residency requirement, the only agency that had a requirement for that could be considered to be a little technocratic would be the RTA. But that was only when it comes to the governor's appointees. And the only stipulation is for them to have some sort of knowledge in transit operations. So it's not very prescriptive, but that was the only one that stated some kind of knowledge in transit as a prereq for being qualified to serve on the board. In terms of voting, the voting was simple majority across board. However, for example, in the RTA in Nashville and in Rock region in Little Rock, because you can have multiple in RTA, for example, because you can have multiple cities within a county be on the board, in a sense, you could sway decisions in your way. With Little Rock, they have the structure of 5 members from the city of Little Rock, and then they have fewer members from the other jurisdictions that receive service. And so even though it's 1 vote per person and it's a simple majority vote, they still have majority on the board. But the reason they have majority on the board is based on the amount of service consumed and provided, as well as their contribution, their financial contributions to the agency. For HRT, they have voting veto within their jurisdiction. So the way it goes is any board members can vote for anything and come up to a vote. However, if a board member opposes an action that affects their jurisdiction, they can veto it and not take place. So any action that affects a particular jurisdiction needs to have agreement from the board members of that jurisdiction as well. So this, summarizing this, we see that for the issue or the question on having elected officials on the board, it varies. From the case studies we looked at, it was more common to see citizen appointees. And even in the case, the only case where we saw a dedicated transit tax, that is for Via Metro, they did not have citizen appointees. However, it is not uncommon to have elected officials when there is a tax that is involved. So moving on to the next question about board membership. So with this, there were 3 main questions that we wanted to address. The first is about Henrico County joining the board. From the beginning of this study and in more recent weeks, there's been more interest and a strong desire from the Henrico side for joining the GRTC board. So in moving forward, looking at the current contribution rates, their service that is received / ridership, having Henrico County join the board would be a positive and it would make sense because of their contribution rates at the moment. The next question would be the question of whether or not adding or taking away service should equal board representation. Now, I would say that for that question, it really depends because you can receive service from GRTC without being a board member. As we saw with Henrico County over the years, they received service successfully without being on the board. So service can be contracted out. However, if there's that desire from an entity or jurisdiction to participate in the board, what needs to be taken into consideration should be what their contribution rates are, the amount of service they have, which could translate into ridership. And then using that information to determine if having board representation would make sense or not, but not necessarily equating service to board membership. Finally, is about having broader representation from the CVTA members because of CVTA funding. So again, arguments can be made about having a strong core in the region, benefiting the entire region as a whole. That is, having that strong system in the GRTC service area, benefiting the entire region. However, looking at across the country, it is very common to have localities to tax themselves into a service area. So what is usually done in other areas is when there's a service, for example, within the urban core, if there are outer jurisdictions that want to participate or want service, they usually would then impose the tax on themselves and say, okay, if you want service, then impose this tax on within your jurisdiction. And so by doing that, then they get representation and service. However, in this case, we have a situation where there's already funding that is being allocated to this. So in terms of having some sort of representation or participation, it could have potential benefits for further collaboration or regionalism. But how to do this, how it can be structured, there are different options for how it can be structured. Let me put it that way. So what are some potential paths forward? Again, the board of directors and the shareholders, they have that power to make the changes to the board by amending their current documents. Adding Henrico County as a third member to the board, it makes sense, like I said, because of their current position. So you look at the CVTA contribution rates and the ridership, considering all of that with local operating contributions, having them on the board would be a positive benefit. For the remaining CVTA members, there are two options that we can consider. Now, I think in moving forward, there are areas that may only want service without representation, or both service and representation. From our discussions, our one-to-one interviews with the various jurisdictions, majority of the CVTA members did mention wanting representation on the board. Whether or not they equated that to having service, it could be thinking of it as having service only without representation on the board, but it was voiced out, that desire to have a say because of the CVTA contributions. So what is a potential path forward in that sense is to have, you can have two ways. The first would be to have representation on the board, but setting in a way to have primary members and secondary members, where the primary members could be the city of Richmond, Chesterfield County, and Henrico County, because they have the highest rates of contribution, ridership, service. And then the remaining CVTA members could have an at-large type member. So I say at-large type because it's not truly at-large, because the idea here is to have them appointed only by the localities within the CVTA that are not on primary members. And they could have rotating appointees on the board. However, whoever is appointed would not only represent the needs of their jurisdiction, but there would be a voice. They are representing the group of the CVTA members. A second option would be to have a committee, which is an example we saw with another authority where they have, on their board, it was only made up of the cities and the counties, but then they also had towns that were within the jurisdiction. What they did was to have the towns form a group where they have a rotating, they have a group of that reviews their project documents or budget, and they have a say in recommendations for final projects that will be funded by the authority. So that kind of committee made up of representatives from the localities, they can provide their recommendations and review projects, having some sort of participation or having a say in the decision-making process. That way, although they are not represented on the board, their opinions are still valued. With this approach, you could say that because the CVTA does review projects that are funded with the authority's funds, in a way, there's already that representation. But when it comes to having a say in the day-to-day board activities, then having that at-large type member would be more beneficial if that desire is there. So what that would look like would be Chesterfield, Richmond, and Henrico would be primary members. And for the secondary members, have one, a position or appointed to the board by the entire group. What could be done for this is to have potential, like a clause in the bylaws for future opt-ins. So some of the jurisdictions may be years away from even wanting service or having service. The truth is that it may be infeasible in certain situations for GRTC to provide service to certain areas. But because of the financial contribution, still having that voice of still having that, promoting that sense of regionalism, this could be something that could be implemented. Again, we can look at the same factors of the financial contributions and any future potential service that may come up. When it comes to the issues of service or ridership, consideration needs to be given to any additional capital that may be required for implementing that service. So for example, you want to talk about how much it would cost to increase the fleet or to purchase new vehicles, employees to service those routes, the associated benefits. These are all added costs that need to be considered in any type of new service that will be implemented. But again, when the question is, should the remaining CVTA members have a say on the board, a potential path forward would be to have that tiered approach of the primary members and the secondary members. So we discussed a few different approaches of what membership on the board could look like. First, there's a simple approach, which many boards do, of just have each person, one person, one vote. So a simple approach would be to just have 25% across. So the city, Henrico and Chesterfield would each have the same voting power on the board, and then the remaining members would form that remainder. Again, these are just examples as a starting point of what it would look like so that you can think about it. The exact composition of the board in terms of the number of people on the board, those details can be looked at after an agreement is made of to even which direction to go. In looking at ridership as a factor, looking at the average annual ridership from 2015 to 2020, we see that the city of Richmond has about 87 or 88% of the ridership, followed by Henrico County and Chesterfield County. If we were to look at the financial contributions, now making this based on the CVTA projections and the local contributions from the approved budget from FY21, the breakout is somewhat different, but it's a little bit more, it breaks out to almost about a third. We have the 29 for City of Richmond, Henrico County at 31, and Chesterfield County at 23. The remaining being made up by the other CVTA members from the CVTA contributions, although they do not have at the moment any that local component, that local contributions. A consideration of what a combination of the factors could look like if we did a 50% ridership majority versus 50% financial contributions is also shown on the screen. And finally, looking at weighting ridership a little bit less than the financial contributions, what would that look like? So these are just to give an idea of potential options moving forward. But again, usually the simple approach is the best approach. With the population, I know something that was mentioned in previous discussions were about having population as one of the factors, but population is inherently captured in looking at the CVTA contributions because the tax base is based on population. So we can say that the CVTA contributions could be a surrogate measure. Outside that, it's difficult to have purely population as a factor, although it's been done in certain jurisdictions around the country. It may not be ideal just because the tie to actual riders, the riders that use the system or the service provision cannot be directly linked. So what needs to be done in order to make changes to the board? The GRTC governance documents would have to be amended. The bylaws, there's the Article 6 of the bylaws that states the representation or the election of the directors to the board. So that would have to be amended. How that can be done would be with an affirmative vote of more than 2/3 of the board. Once that is completed, it has to be ratified by the City of Richmond and Chesterfield County, and then that change can be made. Same with the Articles of Incorporation. They were the restated Articles of Incorporation. Now that again was amended from the 1973 version to include Chesterfield County. So any change that is made again would have to amend the 1989 Articles of Incorporation to reflect those changes. Again,
Stephanie, looks like Dorona has a question.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Dorona.
Sorry, Stephanie. Going back to the previous slide, I was trying to understand if and where the, I guess, value of the, I guess, the companies or the historical equity being reflected. I wasn't sure that, I try to think about it potentially on the ridership, but I mean, that still doesn't equate to the dollars Richmond has put in historically, probably at least 40 plus years. I can get you the exact number, while we consider what CVTA local contributions, being that that's not even proportionally divided in the formula. It's 15% of the total collected. So I think that it needs to be shown when discussing, when showing again, kind of your variations of how you would come up with an approach.
Yeah, So any reference to CVTA contributions here is only referencing the 15% that goes to transit.
But you have split that up when you show these numbers by county or in city. You have attributed a dollar amount proportionally of that 15% to the amount that collected from the different localities shown. And again, it's the total 15%. And logically, I completely understand that. But I do think that without then showing the historical equity, it's really going to not show a clear picture to why going to the next stage, the discussions won't be as easy.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think I addressed that a little bit down the line, but the historical investments that have been made from the city to GRTC can be factored in. But in order to do that, that in itself needs to be valued. What is the total dollar amount, if a dollar amount can be placed on, for the historical contributions of the city to GRTC would need to be determined, so that in moving forward, there's that example of what it would be starting from scratch, let me put it. But that value needs to be determined. So if a further review of purchases over the years of funding that has been put into the company should be reviewed or audited to come up with what that value would be. But in absence of having that value, I don't think it's absent. I think it's something that can be done. It just needs a little bit more time and study from getting like a thorough audit of what that would look like. So I completely agree with your perspective of making sure that the options that are discussed take into consideration what that dollar value of investments from the city looks like, because this table, I admit, is just a snapshot of 2021 dollar values or 2022. So it's just a snapshot. But again, this is not a final recommendation. This is just to give you an idea of what the different options that we've discussed in our meetings prior to today would look like, because there's been talks of, or like options discussed have been about ridership or financial contributions, or population has also been mentioned. But without seeing what that looks like, it would just be abstract, right?
Well,
So
again, I agree, but I do say that the equity in the system is a financial contribution, and again, proof of, and really CVTA is moving forward in future contributions, and that it needs to be noted that it is a financial consideration, that, and even if the recommendation is that that value is determined, because again, if that isn't determined, we won't be able to move to the next step.
I agree. So that comes into play when we're talking now about how many members, or what the voting waiting for votes will be for each jurisdiction. So I agree, and I think we'd put a caveat in there that even looking at financial contributions, it cannot only be based on the CVTA contributions or the annual local contributions for service. So any historical investments should be determined from the city's perspective, and then put on the table so that it's taken into consideration for moving forward. And again, for what we are trying to do is not determine the composition of you get 5 members, you get 6 members, you get 3 members. We won't do that. That is up to the board members and the shareholders. That is up to you. Really, ideally, it's up to Chesterfield and Richmond right now, and then Henrico as a potential third primary member. But in getting the conversation moving and having some progress, there first needs to be agreement on who would be represented, right? So once we know who would be represented, moving forward with how the voting would look like, I think then it's essential that we include the full picture, full financial contribution, not only a snapshot of a snapshot in time.
Okay, thank you.
As stated previously, with the board membership, the main governance documents, which are the articles of incorporation, the umbrella agreement, and the bylaws, would have to be amended and ratified by the city and Chesterfield respectively. Now, finally, the third question, or the third main issue, was the question on GRTC governance. GRTC ownership, and what board membership means for the shareholders. Now, we know that the board changes, they can be implemented without having changes in the ownership structure. You can have board members added to or taken away, as long as it's voted and you have that 2/3 majority at the board level and ratified by the city and Chesterfield. So that can be done. In our discussion with, even in Henrico County, they mentioned they are open to being able to be on the board even without having that shareholder option as well in the short term. So like we said before, all the changes, they just need to be ratified by the city and Chesterfield County. Now, the sale, according to the sale and purchase agreement that was made in '89, concerning the joint agreement by the two entities, it was signed, it was signed by the city, Chesterfield, and GRTC chairman at the time. Any amendments to that written document would have to still have that, any amendment, they would have to have written, a written instrument, let me put it that way, executed by the same entity. So from the GRTC perspective, from Richmond's perspective, and from Chesterfield's perspective as well. Then in '89, when this transaction was done, we saw that Chesterfield purchased the 5 stocks for $50,000. Now the value of that stock needs to be determined today. If you look at the previous articles of incorporation, the value of one stock was listed as $1, but then for the issuance of this share, it was sold for $50,000 for the 5. So any changes in terms of changing the shareholders first needs to start with determining what that value of ownership is for GRTC. Then those changes need to be made in compliance with the Securities Act and any Virginia code, as it was stated out in the sale and purchase agreement. Another point to notice that our registration with Securities Commission was not required because, again, GRTC is still, they cannot make profit from, it's a non-for-profit, or it's a public service corporation, let me put it that way. So they weren't required to register with the Securities Commission. Finally, there was consent, written consent, that was required from Virginia Department of Transportation and the then Urban Mass Transportation Administration. Today, that could translate into something else, perhaps DRPT or another entity. But according to this agreement, that was what was required. So in terms of a path to ownership or moving forward from that, first we need to determine what the appropriate value of GRTC common stock is. A complete audit and review needs to be done to determine what that looks like. Following that, we need to look at what that shareholder structure would look like, because right now, again, it's 50%, 50%. So what would the changes look like? And then execute any amendments within the sale and purchase agreement. Again, with the implications of ownership, although it is a major component that needs to be looked at, with the first step being determining what that value is, changes to the existing governance structure, that is the board, can be made in the short term, while the other implications, the other components of being a full shareholder is dealt with. What needs to be taken into consideration, or what's important, is knowing that even if the board is changed, expanded, added new members, the city and Chesterfield still have that authority at the end of the day to ratify decisions that are made at the board level. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. But to summarize what we've looked at today is with the question of decision-making and accountability and the elected officials. Like we said, first we need to consider if the accountability provided by having the CVTA board members being elected officials is sufficient in terms of looking at purely the funding from CVTA. And also consider the pros and cons of having elected officials on the board. If the interest is purely on funding versus the day-to-day transit operations or transit decisions that are made at the board level, then perhaps the CVTA representation should suffice. In looking at GRTC board representation, having Henrico join the board, the current GRTC board, could be a potential benefit. Looking at their current contribution rates and the service that they have, it would make sense for them to join the board. With their other jurisdictions, the other CVTA members, there's that option of having an at-large type membership, whereas their voice is still heard and they're able to participate, but it still takes into consideration the fact that they do not have existing service, but do have some contributions. And then finally, as just mentioned, these changes can be made without making the changes to the shareholder structure for the board. So the next steps, I think for the next week, what we want to do is just get feedback from GRTC and the city in Chesterfield. What I propose is just trying to schedule a few phone calls, or if the schedule availability isn't there, we could maybe have some questions and have them answered back to us so that we get their opinions on some of the options that we've listed or we've gone through today. And then be able to develop the draft and final documents for review by the steering committee. So I'll take any additional questions at this time.
Hey, Stephanie, it looks like Sharon submitted a question in the chat about how many total shares of common stock currently exist.
Yes.
And did you say 6?
No, sorry. Chesterfield has 5 shares, and the city has 5. It's 10.
Thank you.
They issued, yeah. So initially, the city, it was only the city that owned it. And in the purchase and sale agreement, the GRTC was given, GRTC issued an additional 5 shares to Chesterfield. And so they have that 50% ownership.
Thanks. Any other questions? So next steps moving forward in terms of dates, we are looking at, I see Barb, let me say this really quick. So we're looking at putting this in front of both advisory committees and then the CVTA in June. So that would mean June 9th for the Finance Committee in terms of a draft, June 14th for the TAC, and then on the agenda for June 25th for the full authority so that it can be accepted and passed on to the Governor General Assembly by the 30th. So Barb, question. Barb, you there? Oh, can't get audio. You want to put it in the chat? Okay, while Barb's working on that, anybody else have questions? Okay, there's a comment. Many slides back there was a matrix with funding by the different peer groups. GRTC said member contributions. Is that not entirely correct?
For operating funding, not entirely,
Maybe.
right?
Do you want to go back to that slide and put it back
Oh
up?
yeah. So Barb means to say adding in CVTA contributions to that. So yes, adding CVTA would be correct. I have to check with, in the FY21 budget, there was CVTA contributions added into the locality contributions. Whether or not we received it, I don't know, but.
I think Barb's question is why it probably should say CVTA and locality and not member, right? What is member
Between
referencing?
member, yeah. So the locality, well, GRTC localities they service. Okay.
Okay.
Meaning that member could imply board. It could be that confusion.
Okay.
Yeah, so in this sense, sorry, what was meant is members from like that receive service, member jurisdictions, but that is noted.
Okay. So we'll just, yeah, we'll clarify that. Good catch, Barb.
Yeah. So yes, definitely CVTA and the localities.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have questions or comments?
This is Adrian. Was the slide referring to FY21? Or is that just future breakdowns?
It's just general, yes. I didn't put any dollar amount, but just general because in previous years, it was purely just the localities that receive service, and the CVTA was included in the budget for the FY21. So I think the reason I didn't include CVTA was because it's so new. It hadn't, I don't know if they received any funding yet. Maybe they didn't. You can.
Right, yeah, that's what I was getting at. Yeah, we haven't used any funding for any
Yeah.
operations in FY.
Exactly. So they haven't received any funding yet, but moving forward, it will be CVTA and the locality.
Okay.
Mhm. So Barb says, GRTC board and its role. People get very confused about the board and its role with service. So it's important to say things clearly. But this is discussion about the future. So I think it needs to be considered. Oh yeah, in terms of CVTA funding.
Right. So maybe there's a footnote to that table. Okay. Other questions, comments? Okay, so if we are going back to the agenda, next meeting right now is June 4th, which would be a good time to review the draft. Does that work, Stephanie, or is that pushing the schedule?
I have the final recommendations. I think
Yep.
what we haven't got is any feedback. Like from this call, I was hoping to have some feedback or thoughts on any of the options presented. Maybe we can, when on the 4th, when we present final recommendations, we can have that. But I also like that between now and the 4th, there is that feedback at least, so that the final recommendations do reflect what the stakeholders want.
Sure. So we'll get the slides out for everybody to review and reference, and then ask for comments.
Yeah.
Well, what's good? June 1st?
That should be fine.
Okay.
Hey, Stephanie and Chet,
Holiday. Yes. Fine.
I just want to make sure I figured out how to get my microphone working.
We
Woo!
can
And I
hear
did.
you.
Yeah, I don't know what's happening.
There was this teeny tiny button on my monitor. Anyway, thank you for reading my chat stuff. I did have a question though about taking this to the Finance Committee. Is this a finance issue?
No, but it's a big component of CVTA this year. So just as a nice move, we were gonna. I wasn't planning on asking for approval from finance, just a information item.
Okay.
Stephanie and Chet, this is Joe Vidanis.
Hi, Joe.
Hi. So comments by June 1, will those comments be shared before they get processed, if you will, into the draft? I for one, would love to see what others have to say about things.
Yeah, we could do that. Then if we want to do that officially, then I'd ask for comments by the 28th, just so we have time to compile everything.
I'm fine with that schedule. It's really up to the group though, the 28th,
Sure.
so we can have a time to see those comments. I think it would be helpful for those to be shared.
Yeah, that's fine. I see Rhonda's writing a message, would like to share with the board representative for comment. I think that's fine. We'll just need quick turnaround.
Yeah, very helpful to know what the stakeholders think.
Okay.
Just Adrian,
Okay.
is there an actual draft document in addition to the slides?
No, so the draft report I believe is what Chet was talking about, with having that ready for the Finance Committee meeting on June 9th. Is that correct?
Yes.
Originally, we had, on our slides, we had the 11th, but I think 2 days is not an issue. So the draft final report, if we make it available by the 9th for the Finance Committee, then it will be available to, I assume, the Steering Committee as well.
Yes.
Okay, and there's the opportunity for feedback for that one as well.
Yes.
Well, sure. Yeah. I mean, it'll go to the TAC on the 14th and then the authority on the 25th. So yeah, there'll be opportunity for comment.
I guess from this group though.
Well, so Adrian, are you saying you would like to be able to comment on it before the 9th, before it goes out for the Finance Committee?
Right, yeah, I think it's one thing to react to the slides, but being able to also see, because there's been several PowerPoints throughout, to just see how it builds up to a final report.
Okay. Well, yeah, we're gonna have to get back to you then in terms of if we have enough calendar days to get this together.
Okay.
Yeah, it does seem like we need to, even if it's reviewed with CVTA TAC, we're going to need to have enough time so that CVTA TAC can take action on it at the June 14th meeting.
Right. Yep. Well, I prefer that we can work this out offline and get back to you all with dates when it'll be available. That's okay. Okay, any other questions? Comments? Great, okay. Well, I mean, our intention is to make it available for review by this committee and then put it into the process for review and approval by the authority. So I will confer with AECOM and we'll get back to you with a schedule for release and review and approval. So thank you all for attending today. I think we went a little bit over, but thanks for hanging with us, and look for the slides in the next, maybe this afternoon, and we can get initial comments from you on those in terms of preference and ideas, and then take the next steps. So I hope everyone has a great weekend. Otherwise, we will talk to you all soon. Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah.